Well, welcome to the More to the Story podcast. I am so glad that you all have come along, and I'm looking forward to this episode. Somebody that I've listened to and read for a while now, and I'm excited to maybe introduce him to some of you through this podcast. But first, I want you to know that this podcast comes to you from Wesley Biblical Seminary, where we are developing trusted leaders for faithful churches. And I serve as the president of that institution. And we have a unique moment in our history where we've had our largest enrollment in our 50 years with more than 750 students training to be pastors, many of them serving in denominations, all kinds of denominations, many of them in the pan-Wesleyan world, the Global Methodist, Free Methodist, Nazarene, Salvation Army, Churches of Christ and Christian Union. I could keep listing them, but we're a non-denominational school located in Ridgeland, Mississippi, but we have an online footprint, which makes us available globally. So we'd love for you to find out more about our programs, our bachelor's, master's, doctoral degrees at wbs.edu. Also, I'd love for folks to sign up for my email list at andymillerthird.com. That's andymilleriii.com. And if you sign up for my email list, I'll send you a free tool called 5 Steps to Deeper Teaching and Preaching, a 45-minute video session and an 8-page document to help you prepare to be more creative in your preaching. At the same time, there are some other things available at the website, including a course on the afterlife, a 6-week session there, and then another course on the little book of Jude, which comes right before the book of Revelation. I'd love for you to check that out at andymillerthird.com. All right. I am glad to welcome to the podcast David Bahnsen, who is the founder and managing partner of the Bahnsen Group. He appears regularly on a podcast I listen to almost every day called The World and Everything in It. David, it's an honor to have you on the podcast.
Well, it's very nice to be with you. Thank you so much for having me.
I have to say, Abby, my wife and I are fans. We're like, did you hear what he said today? I don't always understand it. Sometimes I go back through slowly to hear it, but we're so thankful for the way that you kind of present what's happening in markets. But also, I was delighted to hear about your new book, Full Time, which I think kind of gets to some of the principle, represents some of the principles that you have as you advise people with your own financial planning firm and those type of things. I'm really interested in this. And as I read it, I noticed that you use the word dichotomy a lot. And honestly, as somebody who trains preachers, I know that you have some words of critique for the way that preachers have talked about faith and work. So tell me, what was it that led you to write this book?
Yeah, the book does have some critique of the way ministers sometimes talk about faith and work, and it actually has a little bit of critique of the way sometimes ministers live out work as well. And I hope I did it with the appropriate level of graciousness,
yes,
and openness, but nevertheless, there have been some observations throughout my adult life that I felt were worth calling out, as I think it is relevant to the topic. Why do preachers so often seem to preach a message of work that is almost apologetic or defensive, that is sort of tiptoeing around a very robust view of work that is really calling people into an industrious, ambitious, productive lifestyle? And what caused me to write this book was essentially my belief. I turned 50 this last year. I've been in the kind of adult years of my life, working very hard for about 30 years. I've been a believer my entire life. And I've always felt that there was a disconnect in what I believed theologically about work and what I mostly observed in the church. But it was really during the COVID moment that I saw our society seeming to even shy away from the very American ethos about work, that there was becoming this increasingly tolerant view of people that did not want to work, did not enjoy work, and this sort of hypocrisy whereby people who are very unhappy and not very content or satisfied in their life were being told, well, maybe work was the problem instead of the solution. And so I decided I needed to take all my years of passion about this subject and those things that animated me and put it into a book. And that's what Full Time is.
Yes, I love it. And you go through like a really strong theological foundation for that, looking repeatedly at Genesis and this call to what we were created for. Many times we might stop but just say we're created for the glory of God. But you expand on that. Tell us where you take us.
Yeah, and I think it's very important to allow Genesis chapter 1 to speak for itself. And I encourage people with a significant amount of their theological commitments to start in Genesis 1. I think that the doctrine of creation is very important. And what it means to this subject is where it speaks to why God made man. What what we call anthropology is, what we believe about the human person. And I don't have a theology of work apart from my beliefs about the human person, apart from my anthropology. I believe with the Christian tradition that mankind was made in the image and likeness of God, and that mankind was elevated above the rest of the creation, that he was given an increased dignity as an image bearer of God, as people who have souls, people who have eternal destinies, and people who God made to be in relationship with him and to bear his image and likeness. Well, I've understood this, and I think most Christians have understood this vocabulary for a very long time. I'm not sure that enough Christians have thought through the implications of it. What does that mean exactly? So what I tried to do in the book is allow Genesis 1 to tell its own story, that in God so telling us that we were made imago Dei, he defines it as mankind being made to rule over the world, to work and steward it, to cultivate it, to care for it, to extract the value out of the raw materials of the world God had made. That this sort of created purpose was connected to the fact that, like God as a creator, producer, and innovator, we are to be creators, producers, and innovators. And of course, we cannot create out of nothing. Only God alone can do that. But what we can do is create, co-create, sub-create out of his creation. Well, all of that is called work.
Yes.
And so when we talk about dominion, when we talk about caring for the garden, when we talk about stewardship, these are our various functions laid out Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And that's a very important part of the theology here. Genesis 1 and 2 are before the fall, before sin, before the doctrine of original sin. And I think that that's very important as well, because work, like family, was instituted by God before sin.
Yeah, it's interesting. When we think about some of the natural theological foundations that we have, we can sometimes refer to some of them as pre-political. Like, so for instance, I'd suggest that the institution of marriage is a pre-political institution. It's not created by any entity. It's recognized by, but same might be true with work. That work in itself is something that is at the essence of who we are.
Well, I think if you think of some of the major categories in society and in life and the way we organize the what Kuyper called the spheres of life.
Yes.
The two major ones that were very much post-political, if you will, post-fall, were the church and the state. There was not a need for a state, a civil magistrate, before sin entered the world, and nor was there a church per se, which has to do with God's people. He called himself after there being this separation that made a Messiah necessary to begin with. And yet, indisputably, the two things you just said are pre-political, pre-fall. That is the institution of family and the institution of work. And I think we talk about family as Christians as if it were a very important institution. I think people are afraid not to, so that's a good thing. But boy, we sure don't talk about work the same way we talk about family. We talk about work as if it's a threat to family, as if it gets in the way of us being good family people.
Yeah, you quote the very beginning, the very first quote. You have a Dorothy Sayers quote. I'll just read it. Work is not primarily a thing one does to live, but the thing one lives to do. Right. This is this idea. It is, or it should be, the full expression of the worker's faculties, the medium in which he offers himself to God. Yeah. Now, Dorothy Sayers might have had a different idea, outworking of that, but it is essentially what you'd have here with her Catholic worker process. I mean, she has maybe a different image, but I think that this is a helpful process for us to think that we work isn't just something that needs to be in. This is what I guess you're saying, integrated into our life. It is life.
That's exactly right. And when we treat it, another way to put it is people treat it that it's transactional, that it's something you do for the benefits it creates as opposed to for the thing itself. And so another way to look at it is that work helps you provide for yourself. Work helps you provide for your family. Work helps you tithe to your church.
Yeah.
Work might even help you develop a reputation in your community and have a better gospel witness. All of those things are good. None of those things are why we work. They are benefits of work that are sort of extracurricular to the fact that the work itself represents production of goods and services that meet the needs of humanity, that provide soul-stirring activity in our lives. They are existentially meaningful. And so that's why I say in the introduction that I wanted to make an ontological case, that this speaks to the being and the essence of humanity is to be active and productive. And that when we are in a state of idleness and things are happening to us, but we are not happening to things, it's a recipe for significant depression, alienation, antisocial behavior. But it also just simply is not the fruits of a flourishing life. And God calls us to something better.
Yeah, I fully endorse that, and so thankful for the way that you're putting this forward. Before I entered into serving in the theological academy, I was a minister or an officer in the Salvation Army for 15 years and often worked in homeless services. And so like as I was, I facilitated emergency shelters, family shelters and like, but it actually took me a while to get there. I entered into it thinking like, oh, and even what I was given in seminary at times was almost this socialistic type of language to help me think of this. Like I'm redistributing wealth. I'm trying to help people who are on the bottom. Well, for 10 years, I tried to operate in that kind of, with that kind of the bones of that theology. But what I realized was that the way to help people get out of homelessness was to help them learn to be able to develop skills and abilities to become the people God had made them to be. That once they entered into a process where they were able to work their way from the street to their feet, then they were able to really thrive, as opposed to trying to simply give them things. And this, I think charity in general tends towards making people passive as opposed to helping them realize the active capacity they have to be people with dominion.
Well, I agree so much. And I think that it really does come down to that anthropological case that homeless people were made in the image of God.
Yes. Amen. Amen.
And if we believe that there are people who are talented and gifted and productive, and that there are fruits from their labor that can help us provide resources and means to homeless people, then what we're saying is the dignity of those workers is such that it can overcompensate for the lack of dignity of others. But what I would argue instead is that the generosity can be a bridge and fill a gap. But what the purpose of the philanthropy and charity and benevolence needs to be is the dignified position as an image bearer of God of
Amen.
all people. And so whether it's in our political realm, economic realm, or the sort of social category by which we implicitly view people, essentially today it's sort of a half and half view of society. Half of us are meant to be really productive and half of us are meant to be consumers, not always to the severe sadness of homeless, but even today, the tacit acceptance of a significant amount of people who are not homeless, but maybe should be living at home with mom and dad till they're 30 years old.
Yes, yes.
Unproductive, unemployable, unmarriable. And we talk like it's okay, but it's not okay. And it's not just because I look down on it, although candidly I do.
Okay.
It's because I want better for them.
Amen.
That
Yes.
God made them with the same dignity he made me with. And so the notion that we have Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos that are supposed to overcompensate for the kind of subhuman capacity of a lot of other
Wow.
people, I think it's very, very condescending and very unbiblical.
Oh, I'm with you, David. This is great. I mean, I know it's a fairly bold thing to say, subhuman, but ultimately, like, when we're not living into who God has created us to be, that is in part what we're doing. We're not embracing the, as you said, the ontological reality that is a part of our anthropology. You say this is kind of interesting. I had at an event I had for an annual luncheon. I don't know if he's a founder, but he was at least a CEO or one of the first CEOs of the Ritz Carlton, Horst Schulze. He came to our and spoke at our event. He actually was helped by the Salvation Army, decades before. And when I was meeting with him, and he in his speech, he has this famous line that at the Ritz Carlton they say, "We are ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen." Well, we then had started to adapt that line where we said, "We are people loved by God, serving people loved by God." That should, so his idea is, lady, if you think of yourself as a gentleman, then you'll be more comfortable serving ladies and gentlemen. And if we end up thinking like this creational foundation at the start, that then it should affect how we then provide services. I'll let you comment on that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree, and I think it's a real synonymous way of saying it because the way you said it is perfect as is. People who are loved by God, serving people who are loved by God. But the exact same meaning is there, even with interchanging the verb "people made by God,"
Yeah. Yeah.
serving people made by God. And I think that why I like that notion of making is that God made all of us,
Yes.
and in so doing asked us to make things. So you and I are recording right now on technology that it's a byproduct of human endeavor, and we're using hardware. I'm sitting in my apartment in New York City that was made by people over the years that were living out this created purpose. God made things, and then now we make things. And God loved us, and we need to love others enough. And I find it challenging that so many Christians seem content to believe that the very formula for a flourishing life we have utilized is supposed to be different for others. That they should somehow try to experience a place of peace and joy in their life, but we're not going to give them all the cards.
Right. No, I think this is the case. I mean, I think this enters into a place where we commit the sin of paternalism.
Yeah.
Like we suggest that what we have is something. So therefore, aren't we so blessed that we can then provide for somebody else? I think we then play the role of God when we enter into that place when we shouldn't. Now, you also have this. I love this section that you had when you're talking about ambition. And one of the other dichotomies that you work through is the idea that family and career are separated. That shouldn't be the case. I mean, a lot of times, I mean, I know we already hit on this a little bit with at the beginning, with just thinking of the creational mandate. But how is this? How do you see this being played out? This is on page 109 of your book. The false dichotomy of family and career. I found this to be a really helpful chapter for me, particularly as I've moved into something that sometimes people think of more of a career type of position in the academy, as opposed to being people didn't talk about a career, but now they talk about my career. And I'm interested in thinking about this dichotomy.
Well, I think that people tend to look at natural day-to-day organic tensions around the fact that we're finite, so we're limited by time and space, to take that to mean that the various priorities in our life are in tension with one another. I do not deny, rather, that I can't be at my kid's soccer game and at the office at the same time. Well, that's not a particularly profound statement. I do deny that when I'm at the office, it means I'm loving my kid less, or when I'm at the soccer game, it means I'm loving my job less. There is the simple day-to-day wisdom of when we're supposed to be thinking about and working on and focusing on a given thing. But again, back to that word ontology. When I am at the office, I do not take my husband hat off. I do
Yes.
not take my father hat off. When I am at home eating with my kids or taking my wife out to dinner, I do not take my career hat off. All at once, these things coexist in the life of a believer. So when we start using language that is probably for many innocuous, but nevertheless not really precise, that we're trying to balance these things, the
Yes.
analogy I use in the book is that we're treating our lives as if it were a closet that we're trying to compartmentalize and get the space for the sweaters okay and the space for the coats and the space. The fact of the matter is there's going to be seasons of life that are different. There's going to be days of life that are different. If someone has a kid having a medical emergency, they're not going to be thinking about the new deal at work. And if their kids are healthy and happy and they have a big deal to close at work, they're hopefully not going to be thinking about a stupid 5-year-old birthday party kind of, it's just the reality of life. And we put this pressure on ourselves for very sanctimonious reasons. But it's very funny how one-sided it is. It's always towards the purpose of a lower view of work and a higher view of other things that have the net effect of virtue signaling.
Mm-hmm.
They have
Mm-hmm.
the net effect of Phariseeism, of making us
Yes.
sound like we're something extra spiritual or extra moral or whatnot.
Yes.
And even that triangle view I've heard so many times when people say, well, God comes first in my life, my family comes second, church comes third, and work comes fourth. Well, there's nothing about that that is biblical. God is the foundation of our entire life, and his kingdom is encompassing of all he has asked of us. And we have out of our view of kingdom a very elevated priority for all of the above. And the way in which we make God the number one priority in our life and honor him and obey him and trust him and love him is in these different facets, not one on top of each other. And so while there are certainly different depths to the loves and commitments, you make a permanent vow to your spouse, and you don't make the same vow to your a given job. But the way we talk about it is, again, pitting them against each other. And what I'm
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
asking believers to do in this book is rethink that. Maybe rethink the motives as to why we do it. Because I
Mm-hmm.
think with the right introspection, we'll find out that what we're really doing is trying to find a convenient way to relegate work to a less important part of our life.
Wow. Yeah. 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 It's so interesting. And part of this challenge comes with the way that, again, it's an anthropological issue to think that human, and this impacts how we think about the basic tenets of the economy. Do we exist? And you have a section on this for consumption. Like,
Right.
is that why we're around? Talk to us about that economic theory and what the problem is, the theological problems are with it.
Yes, and so in economics, and this is the great passion of my life, to apply a distinctly Christian worldview to the field of economics, of entrepreneurialism, risk taking, and the way in which financial markets become a tool and resource in all of the above. And I do believe that there's a fundamental economic battle of ideas about the importance of production versus consumption. And so people could kind of their eyes glaze over because they think this is sort of academic, it's sort of political. It pits, guys like John Maynard Keynes against Friedrich Hayek or Milton Friedman, and they think of it as just an economic academia. But it is really fundamentally a disagreement about anthropology. Devising economic policy as if we must first and foremost realize mankind is here to consume versus devising it around the fact that God made us to produce is a categorically different view of the world.
Mm.
And I am a production first economist. In the more modern realm, we've talked about it as called the supply side movement. I believe that this is somewhat obvious that none of us can consume if we haven't first produced. There
Yeah,
is
sure.
nothing to consume if it is not first produced. That production drives consumption and creates very virtuous cycles in terms of of our life, and that we really kind of create a more coherent economic way of thinking out of production first. But that stems for me from a spiritual lesson that in God making mankind in his image, he did not make us first and foremost as consumptive actors, but as productive actors. And when we produce, we have the resources now to be able to consume. But when others produce, we have something to consume. There is 2 parts production for every 1 part consumption. And it creates a lot of growth and a lot of progress and a lot of elevated quality of life when we think of things this way.
Yeah, with this idea of production first. Now, being somebody who listens to you most Mondays, it seems like these ideas, consumption versus production, are even just a part of your basic analysis of what's happening in the macro level picture of the economy in our country. I mean, you see this kind of working itself out even in this election cycle. I mean, I'd be curious your thoughts on like how you see this practically working its way into what type of things we invest in, or then on the other side, what political, like how we think about politicians and what their proposals are.
Well, look, the supply side movement is most often thought of as a byproduct of the Reagan presidency of my childhood. And for good reason. He was very much philosophically converted to this belief that we needed to, on the margin, see government remove impediments to production, and that it would then produce greater prosperity throughout society. And so there's a good reason we think of it this way, that essentially production first, when applied to political economy, means lower tax rates. And it could mean deregulation. And I would add that there's even some who've gotten a little bit more sophisticated that see like energy independence or even school choice or things like that as part of that policy portfolio. But it still has largely been thought of, unfortunately, as a political issue, something in the realm of public policy. And it does entail public policy, but that it was never the holistic message about production first economics. Production first economics is an entire worldview about ontology, our very being. And to the extent that in the policy realm, the implications are when we are, if you tax more of something, you get less of it, that we were taxing productivity too much, and that therefore the less we tax productivity, the more productivity we get. These things are not super complicated, and yet I feel that we kind of, by omission, made a mistake. I want to remind people that while I favor lower marginal tax burden and a lower regulatory burden, I favor it to the extent it's connected to a philosophy of mankind as a producer. And so I don't think we win this battle just talking about tax rates all the time. We make an argument for lower tax rates. They make an argument for higher tax rates on the basis of equity or social justice or something like that. And it misses the anthropological argument that mankind is a producer. And so there's a lot of reasons in the modern state why, Keynes believing that consumption had to drive economic activity. But they all start with a flaw about the human person. The agenda was that if mankind is a consumptive animal, then you can manipulate their consumptive desires. And if you're going to manipulate their consumptive desires and in so doing create economic growth, well, what a better way to do that than have a sort of central planner who's behind the manipulation of our consumptive desires. What they miss out on is that mankind needs no such stimulus to want to consume. That from human nature, God made us with appetites. We do not need to be told to like a steak dinner or a vacation or,
Yeah, sure.
Those things are innate to the human person. Incentives are not necessary for consumption. Incentives are necessary for production.
Right. So what would be one of those things, an incentive that could be put into place? I mean, maybe it's just antithetical to the basic idea, but by the government to help incentivize work? What are some of those things that we could
It's the
do?
removal of impediment. And so
Okay.
government functions best by negative act over versus positive. That, in other words, most affirmative steps the government could take to incentivize would be distortive. They would alter the natural order of things, probably result in them picking winners and losers, probably result in favoritism or cronyism. And yet the negative example of removing an impediment to productivity, those are quite clear, primarily lowering tax burdens, regulatory burdens, not having policy that inhibits the access to energy, things like that. So government plays a role, but I do think the vast majority of it, not entirely, but the vast majority is in government removing impediments to productivity versus trying to go drive productivity proactively.
So then by removing these impediments, the idea is like if people are spending less money on taxes, regulation, they'll then take that money and then use it for more jobs to stimulate people to help. They would want to use their money to serve more people, to produce more.
Yeah, but there's a much more important point though that I think you're right about it mathematically, that the more money they have when they're done working, the more they could use it for productive purposes, and that's very true. But I think it goes far more than that.
Okay.
That they won't do the work to create the money to begin with, because we're so rational. This was where Reagan discovered that no Hollywood actor wanted to make a movie after the first half of the year because they figured out that they were already paying the way their marginal tax bracket worked, that the first movie they made, they kept 80% of their pay. The second movie they kept 70, the third they kept 50, but after that they were only keeping 30%, and so they stopped making movies till the next year.
Huh.
Well, it's very obvious that we work that way. But what the supply side movement says is not just that we're going to put the money we keep to more productive use, but that we're not going to do the work when there is incentive not to. And so that's why all economics is marginal. Everyone's familiar with the theory of marginal utility. On the margin, when you tell a producer that they're going to keep more of the next incremental unit that they exert, then you're going to get more incremental units. And whether it be investment, whether it be risk taking, whether it be extra hours worked, there's all kinds of elements in both capital and labor where this principle comes to play.
Yes, this is all fascinating. I'm curious what this says then, and you have a chapter on this about retirement. How should we be thinking about retirement? I see. Yeah, I gotcha. And I'll give you I've been watching, for those of you watching on YouTube, David has very slowly I'm not sure if he's in New York or LA. It says, but the sun is rising wherever he is. And so the line has been going, and slowly it's like gotten down into his eyes. I've seen it's been able to get in the way. I encourage people to take a look. David also has an online source called the Dividend Cafe. That would be something for you to check out. And I know I didn't mention it before, of course, but you'll see him on news channels, occasionally speaking about the economy and markets. He's written other books. I mean, he's The Crisis of Responsibility, Our Cultural Addiction to Blame and How You Can Cure It, The Case for Dividend Growth, Investing in a Post-Crisis World. And then there's No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths. I think we're hearing a lot of those come through in the first part of this conversation. So it's really helpful to get that in place. Okay, it looks like the sun's out of your face. So that's
yes,
good.
Yes. I'm here at my apartment in New York City, and I live right on Gramercy Park, and we're at a beautiful time of day, but it just happens that the sun was going to take me out entirely. So forgive me.
Yeah, no problem. But I was curious in your chapter about retirement. What if, I mean, obviously most people, for me, for instance, when I think about investing money, I'm mainly thinking about a retirement. Like I have my goals. I know when my plan is. I'm planning to retire, but you have a different way of looking at it. I'm curious if you could just outline that here for us a little bit.
Yeah, if every single thing that people are talking about when they talk about retirement, saving towards the financial goal of retirement, the modeling and cash flow projections, financial planning that is done. If everything were the same and the use of the word retirement was meant to convey a period of financial freedom, of financial flexibility, of financial independence, I have no problem with it at all. If what one means by the term is I am working for the purpose of not having to work anymore, then that's what I take exception to.
Yes.
Now, it is true that there is a whole culture and cottage industry and vocabulary ecosystem that has been created around this idea of retirement and imagery of somebody in a more senior year of their life wearing a sweater and going on a sailboat or walking on the beach with their wife or golfing 7 days a week. I just want to be very clear that this stuff was concocted by Madison Avenue in the last 4 or 5 decades, because for thousands of years before that, these were entirely foreign concepts to the entire world. The retirement planning before the baby boomers entered the workforce was called death. People died.
Yeah, yeah.
And it is a blessed thing that it changed for 2 reasons. A, people are living longer. That's where retirement came from, was that the baby boomers entered the workforce, and by the time they were, from the time they were born to the time they entered the workforce, average mortality went up by 10 years. And by the time they entered the workforce till the time they were at retirement age, it went up another almost 10, nine more. It went up 19 years from the time that they were born to the time that they were at retirement age, so to speak. 2 different 10-year extensions of life expectancy, from roughly age 60 to roughly age 80. A little bit younger for men, a little bit older for women. And then this also coincided with post-war prosperity that gave people the financial means to do so. So not only did they live long enough to quote unquote retire, but with IRAs and 401ks and pension plans and things, there were financial instruments created to help facilitate it. So the boomers became the first generation in human history that entered the workforce with their eye on exiting the workforce so as to end their life on a 25-year vacation. I am all for people having age and stage differences in what they will do in the senior years of their life. For one thing, a significant amount of people that their back hurts after work every day, they physically would not be in the same position that many white-collar people like myself may be in. And yet at the same time, I cannot get behind the idea that someone should enter a phase of life where they are divorced from any useful activity. And of course, there are some who say, no, I'm retired. I'm spending all kinds of time with the grandkids, and I'm vacationing and all those great things. And I'm still active because I'm on a board. I go to a board meeting once a quarter, or I volunteer at church once a month or something. And I get it, but that's not really what I'm referring to. I think a day-to-day usefulness, sometimes still connected to what you did in your career, sometimes maybe not. I'm not trying to legalistically impose a script for everybody. I do happen to believe that for a lot of people, what they did for 30 or 40 years, gaining maturity, experience, expertise, wisdom, is probably where they're going to be most useful in the senior years of their life as well. Maybe mentoring, maybe in an advisory capacity, maybe, less hands-on. But again, the financial freedom of retirement is not the problem. It is the belief, implicit or explicit, that work is done so you won't have to do it anymore. That's what I'm pushing back on.
Yeah. David, imagine like you in your mid-70s at whenever that comes. What do you hope your life looks like at that period? What are you hoping you're going to be doing?
I hope it looks exactly like my wife looks now.
Yes, great.
I've been I've been a very well off person for a long time. There was never a moment in my financial freedom that I ever thought about having nothing to do when I got out of bed in the morning. And so I may be a little unique here that it is very, very important to me to get up with a purpose each day. And I enjoy every moment with my wife and my children. And in my 70s, I'll have grandchildren, Lord willing. I don't have grandchildren right now at age 50. But no, I have absolutely no desire to be cut off from promoting a free society when I'm in my 70s, from managing money on behalf of clients, from facilitating entrepreneurship and various forms of risk taking that drive economic growth. All the things I'm doing right now, I intend for me to do until they put me underground.
Gotcha. I love it. This is so good. I saw this picture one time that came up on my social media, and it was a picture of a retired couple who I forget what it actually said, but the idea was here they were like going through a ride at Disney World, and they had waited to for retirement to finally do these type of things, but they were both like completely asleep, laid out on this ride at Disney World. Like they're exhausted by the time they get there. Like you work all this time so that you can then have this extended vacation. Instead, why not live now? Like maybe you don't have maybe people might not have the capacity to do those type of things with your children financially, but make sure you're taking these times as best you can. Like that's what my sense is. There's no need for a bucket list at the end of your life. Instead, like this is an opportunity for now. And also it assumes too, that this life is it. Like as Christians, we affirm the resurrection of the body, the new heavens and new earth, that we're going to have an opportunity to continue. And I think to continue to work in the new creation to a certain degree. I mean, have you thought a little bit about the eschatological dimensions too, of how work is a part of the new creation?
Well, I've thought about it for my entire life, but what I've been trying to do in the book is help provoke others to think about it, because I do
Yes.
believe that a lot of Christians have been given a visual of
Mm.
heaven that is going to be a very big surprise to them. If you believe theologically that the new heavens and new earth is a new heaven and new earth, that it is the restoration of Edenic conditions,
Yes.
that God made mankind with a particular purpose and perfection that was distorted by sin, and that we are living in the process of God redeeming these things to himself. As you referred to it earlier, the pre-political state of man, the pre-fall state of man involved mankind working, I do not have any idea why people think they won't be working in heaven. It is most
Yes.
certainly not in Scripture. It's hard, understandably, for us to visualize and conceptualize work divorced from sin, because none of us have ever worked apart from sin. And so the
Mm-hmm.
strain in relationships, where work comes in when there's trust and where there is a lack of some of the impediments to those things, it's hard for us to understand that, and I get it. But the idea that we will not be engaged in productive, God-glorifying, growth-oriented labor in heaven is most certainly not found in the Bible.
Yes, indeed. It certainly isn't in the Bible. Now, I'm interested as somebody who's training pastors, and most of my audience probably are people who are in vocational ministry. You have a chapter helping pastors see that what you suggest that many pastors have, and I'm quoting page 168, a horrifically inadequate work ethic.
Yeah.
So this is your chance. You get to speak to my audience, a lot of pastors in it. So tell us, what is it that many pastors have horrifically wrong with our work ethic? I agree with you, by the way. I just want to say that at the front.
Well, I think the first thing I'd say, because I say it in the book, is that I'm well aware that I'm painting with a broad brush, that it is not true that all pastors do. I've known some pastors, and in fact, I was the son of a pastor who worked tirelessly. My book is dedicated to my late
Yeah, I saw
father,
that.
who is the hardest working human being I've ever been around in my life. So I know there are plenty of pastors out there working very hard, but I have anecdotally observed many ministers in my adult life that I do not believe had the same understanding of work ethic that many in the private sector, many that are more susceptible to market forces necessarily have. And I also think there's a lot of pastors today, and this is a newer phenomenon as best I can tell, that might be busy a lot, but I'm not sure it's the same thing as working hard at being a pastor. And so I just have a particular theological view of what is required of a shepherd. And I think if someone is busy a lot in self-promotion, but not busy a lot in shepherding their congregation, in doing the dirty work of ministering, of preaching the gospel, of leading their flock, I don't consider that the job. And so it's a rough and maybe a little bit crude analogy, but if someone worked as a kind of middle manager at IBM and they went to work every day and all day they were really busy writing on their blog or trying to help get more social media followers, and it did absolutely nothing to help IBM, but they're busy all day long. Would any of us consider that a hardworking person?
Yeah.
I think too many pastors are distracted by the extracurricular.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I mean, doing that hard work of making sure that we're with people in their not just their most difficult moments, but ensuring some of those pastoral responsibilities are met. I mean, so now that I'm in this role, I'm often talking to people about the way that they think, what they think of ministers and like what they want ministers to be. We say we're developing trusted leaders for faithful churches. Well, that then, when I say that line, it often leads to people telling me what they don't like about their ministers, right? And so I open myself up to that. But one of the things is, one of the principal things, visiting doesn't like there's a lack of visitation, and then inevitably preaching. And I'm a preaching instructor, and one of the things I have to work through is just making sure people realize the significant commitment that they're making in their preparation, in their sermon preparation. Like, this is a key task. It's like too often kind of like pushed off to the side. And so like one of the things that we're committed to is making sure that we're like recognizing those deficiencies that a lot of folks have. But I think it's similar to that. Like, well, what's happening? How active is somebody on Facebook?
Yeah. Well, I agree entirely. One thing I pointed out in the book, which I'm being very genuine, was a shock to me because I just didn't know. I grew up in a very small church. My dad was a minister for his whole adult life in a Reformed Presbyterian church and denomination. And he preached about 50 Sundays a year. Often, even on the 2 Sundays he wasn't preaching in our church, if we were on family vacation, I spent much of my childhood with him preaching in a church somewhere else when we were on vacation. And I'm not suggesting that the litmus test needs to be 50, 51, 52. And I certainly don't think, because in my dad's day they did it this way, everyone else needs to go through the same. But I started attending different churches as an adult, me and my wife, and I did not know that many pastors preach 20, 25 times a year. It was just news to me. And now I see it as basically the norm. And I think you're making a point about how much prep time and effort they put into preparing a weekly sermon. And that's a whole area of deficiency. But then I would combine that with how often they're even preaching to begin with.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that's different, I want to be fair. Some pastors are preaching 4 times a weekend. And so, that may be more grueling and tiresome in a way that now you're going to preach less weekends than, say, a minister who only preached once or twice back in the day. I mean, I understand every congregational situation is going to be different. But I was animated to write that chapter, not because I'm mad at pastors, but because I love pastors. And I believe that there has become a bit of cultural movement that has put downward pressure on their rigor.
No, I think that's right. I appreciated it. I'm glad that you're willing to say it, to take these challenging topics and be able to bring it to people so they can think about this.
It was a pretty risk-free thing for me to do.
I guess not risk for you. It'd be risky for me. That's it. Okay, David, I have a 17, 15, and 13-year-olds. My 17-year-old works at Chick-fil-A. My other two, and he's saving for a car. Then I have my other two are doing all the jobs they can. But let's say if I could get you into my office, I could get my kids here, and you have 3 minutes to talk to them, like, and to encourage them about how they are to pursue work in their life. What would you say?
Well, I would say that my kids are 19, 17, and 14. So our three ages are not all that far
Yeah,
apart.
sure.
And my kids have been taught that work is not something you do because if you don't do it, you're going to starve. It's that it's something you do because we are meant to be productive and active. We hone our skills. I did not grow up in a wealthy household by any means. And my kids have grown up with a very significant difference in their material well-being than I did. And yet the principles are identical, that they work because it is the way in which human beings can have the most fulfilling lives. I was very fortunate with my oldest, who's now a sophomore in college, that he just had a really strong work ethic. He was a very driven, ambitious young man, and was always looking for activity to begin with. My daughter is very capable, hardworking, very, very smart. But then from her vantage point is, why did I got to go work at the ice cream shop when you can afford to get me all these things anyways? And I said, honey, I'm rich. You're not rich. And I wanted her to learn the discipline of she's worked at camps over summertime and ice cream shop, those kinds of things. So I'll share a quick story, and I would share this with your kids if I was, doing this hypothetical you posed. When my book first came out earlier in the year, National Review did a big event for me at the Union League Club here in New York City. And Andy Puzder, who was the CEO of Carl's Jr. and was going to be President Trump's labor secretary, and Dan Roth was a Treasury Department official in a couple of different presidential administrations, and myself were in a panel for this release of my book. And these are very successful, accomplished people. Andy's a very wealthy guy. All three of us worked at an ice cream place in high school. It was coincidence.
Okay. Yeah.
But it occurred to me that was not merely, they learned how to get up and go to work and they learned how to sweep a floor, which is a very valuable thing. And you learned how to get along with a boss who wasn't very good, or to take orders, from a supervisor, or get along with a coworker. All those things are very good. But I do not believe it is a coincidence that 90% of CEOs in Fortune 500 companies worked jobs in high school. Mm-hmm. And that almost 0% of, almost 100% of unemployed 25-year-olds were unemployed teenagers. It is very rare that the skills you learn in working as a teenager don't parlay into some element of your adult life, and that the negative lessons learned as a teenager would not parlay into your adult life. So yeah. I believe that that's the real beauty of it, is you hone skills. Nobody thinks you're going to scoop ice cream cones for your whole career, but you scoop ice cream cones one day and you learn skills that are the same skills in a very embryonic form that a CEO of a company needs one day.
Yeah, no, this is really important. I'm going to drop back to something that might take us a little longer, but I can't help it because it was a conversation that I was having with my kids on this very subject. As we were driving down the road, there was a sign. We're recording this in October 2024. Political election, presidential election is on the horizon. And it said, I won't say the political candidate, but everybody will figure it out. This candidate promises to raise minimum wage, right? To raise the minimum wage. Now, this led to a conversation with my children to think about, why is it that there is a minimum wage? And I was talking about Andy, he's my 17-year-old. I want him to have a job. Now, I don't know if he needs to be making as much as he is, but he is nevertheless. Tell us why, how this conversation about trying to help kids develop skills and hone skills, how is that connected to what a minimum wage does, or what a minimum wage might prevent? That might be a better way of saying it.
Well, the economic principle here is very important. I absolutely believe in a minimum wage. It's called zero. The minimum wage is not set or imposed. The minimum wage is discovered.
Hello.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, I like that.
So right now, down the hallway, there's a person I don't know who I am in the current process of not hiring them to do work for me.
Okay.
I am their minimum wage with me is $0. I don't need value from them. They don't have a service to offer me. So the wage I'm willing to pay for this is nothing. Okay. That's an
Yes.
obvious example. But then when you push it out to the people you need to sweep the floors, I worked as an usher at a movie theater, and there was a wage that it was worth it to the movie theater company to pay us to do it, and there would have been a wage it wasn't worth it. But if the government comes in and sets a minimum wage, they can't change the real minimum wage, which was zero. And so if the number were 25 that the government's setting, it was 10 to the company. Then by altering it, all they did is default to the natural minimum wage, which is always and forever zero. And ultimately, minimum wage laws and elevated minimum wage has done nothing but hurt teenagers. The notion that some of these jobs are supposed to be career jobs for people was never the case. And so it incentivized and has facilitated and driven the disintermediation. There are less people now that will get hired at a McDonald's. There are more kiosks at grocery stores
Yeah.
because somebody tried to alter the organic minimum wage. There are victims from the policy, but there are not beneficiaries.
Mm. Mm.
And to the extent people say, no, that boss was going to hire that person at 10, and because of Bernie Sanders, they're now hiring him at 15, all you're doing is focusing on a visible beneficiary and ignoring an invisible beneficiary who didn't get a job, a teenager who didn't get part-time summer work or what have you, or the amount of people that didn't get hired at all because they then instead came up with a replacement. And so this is just an economic principle, but in a sociological sense, the data is unbelievably clear. These are largely jobs that were part-time and hourly wage that for the longest time went to teenagers, often part-time summer work, and throughout a school year, college students, and those jobs have largely gone away. And so you have the problem of less productivity from teenagers, less skills being honed, less available workers. Anyone who saw when we had the labor shortage a few years ago, when you couldn't get service at a restaurant and things like that. But then I
Yeah.
will add, those people that didn't have part-time work when they were 17, they're going to eventually have their first job when they're 21, 22, 23. They're going to start off less prepared
Yeah, sure.
than they
Yep.
had than if they had had the training of this hourly work at the proverbial ice cream shop.
Yeah, no, that is definitely a case. Well, thank you for taking time. I couldn't help but bring that question up as you're, addressing the hypothetical of talking to kids. I think that's really a part of the nature of what this is trying to do. All right, David, it's my podcast is called More to the Story, and I always ask, is there more to the story of Dave? Now you're out there a lot. You're on TV, you're online, you have your Dividend Cafe, all these things. But is there something you don't talk about a lot? Some hobby that you have? There's a more to the story of David Bahnsen?
Well, I do certainly have different hobbies and extracurricular things that I enjoy a great deal in my life. When you talk about the TV and podcast and those things that have sort of a public profile, even those things all put together represent less than 10% of my time. I am very blessed to have 71 employees in my business. I spend my days talking to clients, working with clients, and helping to be a solutions provider around capital and trying to put capital to use for the kingdom of God. And I absolutely love what I do. I'm very blessed to have the career, the business, the team. I'm very blessed to have my wife alongside me in the company.
Okay.
We work together every day. She's my partner in life, soulmate. And so those are the blessings in terms of my work life. For fun, I love reading books. I love USC football. And when I'm
Okay.
not being very obedient on my diet, I love Chinese food.
There you go. Yeah. And what do you think of joining the Big Ten?
Well, I'm
USC.
thrilled for it. I think that it was high time for USC to leave abusive relationship in the Pac-12. The fact that USC has lost 4 games in the Big Ten so far by a combined total of 9 points is, a little disturbing. But that has everything to do with us not finishing football games well lately. But we're going to be very successful in the Big Ten. I assure you of that.
Okay, well, I've been a Big Ten fan since there were 10 teams. So, and I'm also a Chicago Bears fan, and I just say thank you for Caleb Williams.
Yeah,
We're
he's a
enjoying having him.
very special young man. You got a good one there, I promise you.
Well, David, thanks for your time today. I appreciate your ministry and your work and the way that you are fulfilling this calling. That's at the essence of like who we are as humans, and for articulating that so clearly as an economist for us. And you did a great job theologically doing that. So I recommend people check out his book, Full Time: Work in the Meaning of Life. Thanks, David, for coming along.
Thanks so much for having me, and thank you for all your very thoughtful questions. God bless.